Dr. Andrzej Bober is a veterinary doctor who specializes in insects, deputy chair for bee diseases in a laboratory for European and American foulbrood and varroas, an expert of the Puławy Research Institute and State Research Institute, participates of various scholarships in Apipatology. I believe that the most important of those stays are visits to Hohen Neuendorf in Germany, Central Agricola Regional in Spain, National Bee Unit in the United Kingdom, and he also delivered plenty of papers in Poland and abroad, authored scientific articles, and also popular scientific articles promoting science to beekeepers. He is a member of Kolos. We've had an opportunity to meet plenty of members of Kolos Association. You're probably getting closer and closer to that. What else can I tell you? He is one of the coordinators of Polish national epidemiologic studies on losses in bee colonies. It's very significant because we want to know what's going on and why we're losing bees. And this study goes on in parallel in 17 countries. That research is perfectly well coordinated, and it serves coordination of information about the health and about the colony losses in all participating states. The work is very difficult, but also very useful. Well, why don't you join us for the first lecture today?
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you very cordially. It is my great pleasure to be among such a distinguished group of speakers. Thank you very much for inviting me. That goes to the organizers. Today I would like to tell you a few words regarding the trading of bees. Trading of bees, selling bees, is performed frequently, but let us remember that it is regulated by different acts of law and different methods that we have to follow, so that the trade of bees is not related to a risk of spreading dangerous diseases. Ladies and gentlemen, today, nowadays, we can say that the world is getting smaller and smaller. As you can see, the world is diminishing, and we have different transportation methods available, as a result of which we can very quickly and swiftly move. So we can be mobile, and as a result, the distances that used to be very problematic are not problematic at all anymore. Of course, each of the transportation modes, transportation methods are related to certain risks, because obviously transport is necessary indeed, and we live in the times where we need the transport to have access to different produce. Sadly, along with the transport, along with the mobility, along with moving of goods, we are dealing with certain threats. We have to be aware that each single transport, each single consignment obviously contains goods, things that are controlled, verified, supervised and checked regarding whether they can be transported or not. But we have to mention that very frequently in such consignments, especially when it comes to plants or biological materials, we may deal with a situation where, besides what we want to transport in an intended way, we may also have something accompanying it in an intended or unintended way that we never planned to transport. Being aware of the different processes that may occur, that may happen, then globally and within EU, different laws have been introduced so that it is possible to have them as a foundation and use them to avoid different threats and risks related to the trading of animals. Now, when it comes to organization that is focusing on animal health including the bees obviously, globally, that's OIE, namely World Organization for Animal Health, with its headquarters in Paris. But when it comes to the EU itself, all the tasks and work and responsibility related to the health of bees and safety related to beekeeping, this is the task of a relevant unit of the EU Commission, relevant agency of the EU Commission. When it comes to information regarding the health status of the animals or the conditions to be fulfilled for the consignment so that they can be traded, for that we have certain documents, information documents that are available on the website of OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, and these very documents include guidelines. These are guidelines, these are not regulations of law, because this law has to be introduced in each country or member state based on these guidelines, be it the European Union or out of EU. And in these documents we may find information on specific diseases. So, looking specifically at the law and guidelines regulating important diseases of bees that may impact the world trade of bees and that may be a threat, that's obviously the infestation of honeybees with Acarapis woodi, that's the infestation with American foulbrood, infestation with European foulbrood, as well as small hive beetle, Tropilelaps mite, and varroa mite. For each of these conditions, or for each of these infestations, parasitic infestations, we have detailed requirements regarding what can be traded and what are the requirements when it comes to the trading of bees or material coming from bee colonies, so that we can trade them safely, avoiding the spreading of these pathogens that I mentioned before. Well, obviously, the OIE, the World Organization for Animal Health, continues to gather data on the outbreaks of specific diseases. They deliver information regarding where a disease has been found, in what country, what member state, what is the current status of the disease. So on the OIE website, we can always look into the WAHE system and learn where which diseases are present or for how long they have been present. Obviously, we have to remember that information owned and presented by OIE are information sent from very many countries and then processed. And this results in the fact that the information presented on this website are displayed with a certain delay. Still, nevertheless, it is a very precious tool based on which we can inform ourselves regarding different diseases present worldwide. As it was mentioned in the introduction to this day, very frequently the information flow is insufficient, and hence our knowledge, our expertise without a relevant tool cannot be expanded. Moving on to regulations that are in force and binding for the European Union. Here you can see a document that regulates everything related to diseases of all animal species. This is a document that is simply called Animal Health Law. The Animal Health Law, of course, as I said, covers all animal species farmed and bred by people, including bees. Here we have a regulation, the Animal Health Law. This is not a new regulation. The Animal Health Law has been published for the first time in 2016, so 5 years ago. However, because this document is very extensive and containing a lot of information and a lot of new requirements, some parts of it have been put in force successively. The whole body of the Animal Health Law has been in force since April, 21st April 2021, so this year. In fact, this is a basic document that has been regulating now, anything related to animal keeping and all processes related to it. Of course, in the territory of the European Union. Interestingly, which is worth mentioning, in 2016, when this document was published for the first time, sadly, no bee diseases were included in the first version of the document. That obviously brought about certain concerns. Why it happened so? Well, luckily, the European Commission rather quickly came to a conclusion that bees are extremely important, so it is definitely worth getting interested in them and covering their diseases in the regulations of law. As a result, already in 2018, we have seen another regulation entering into force, the regulation that has been giving more detail to animal health law. So already in 2018, 18 in the Commission delegated regulation, we see that when we talk about trading of bees within EU or third countries, to and from third countries, the following pathogens, parasites have to be taken care of. That's varroa destructor, small hive beetle, American foulbrood, and Tropilelaps. And the American foulbrood has been paid particular attention to. The same year, we have seen yet another implementing regulation that looks at disease prevention and control rules to categories of listed diseases. And as the title suggests, it categorizes certain diseases and the ways of controlling them. And as a result, the diseases have been divided into 5 categories. Regarding the territory of the European Union, you can see here on the slide all 4 diseases mentioned by me before. They have been listed as D and E, including viruses, that is C, D, and E. What does this mean for us? What do these letters and categories mean for us? Well, category C disease means a listed disease, obviously, and it is considered to be of relevance to some member states of the EU, and for which measures are needed to prevent it from spreading to parts of the EU that are officially disease-free or that have eradication programs for the listed disease concerned. Next category, category D. This covers all of the diseases that I mentioned because category C was just for varroa. Category D disease, of course, is a listed disease for which measures are needed to prevent it from spreading on account of its entry into the Union or movements between member states. And finally, the last category. That's category E disease, and category E disease means a listed disease for which there's a need for surveillance within the European Union. So, as I mentioned before, varrosis, small hive beetle, Tropilelaps mites, or American foulbrood are diseases that are listed, meaning the European lawgivers pay particular attention to. What next? Well, obviously, I am perfectly aware of the fact that the regulations of law presented by me may not be fascinating or very interesting, but ladies and gentlemen, there is no way to present this subject otherwise. I'm really trying to make this presentation to be a guideline, an indication for you what are the sources of information. I'm trying to present where to look for certain pieces of information. But I also believe that it doesn't make sense to analyze all the regulations of law point by point, article by article. I have just selected most important articles of law binding in force now and selecting most important articles, so it is easy for you to find it. So, continuing, yet another regulation, Commission delegated regulation from 2019. This is a regulation that regulates the movement of bees to other member states. So here we're talking about trading within the EU, and we are talking also about trading between member states, the movement of honeybees to and among member states. And The relevant article says that operators shall only move honeybees in any stage of their life cycle, including honeybee brood, to other member states, where certain requirements are fulfilled. Namely, when the animals in the hives do not show signs of American foulbrood infestation, where they have not been found to be infested by small hive beetle or Tropilelaps mites. Further on in the documents, we see different areas and radiuses that or the movement of bees for a certain distance, and or the source of bees and the radius around within which the diseases have to be absent. On the other hand, when it comes to introducing bees from third countries into the EU, well, here in this regulation, we have several requirements to be fulfilled. When it comes to the movement of bees between the EU and third countries, this is the most significant document. That's another delegated regulation of the EU from January 2020. You can see the number on the slide. And this regulation very precisely regulates the movement of bees in articles from 63 to 72. So these articles describe all elements, all requirements for the transport of bees from third countries into the EU. This document contains information regarding what can be the subject of movement, and here it's worth stressing that the only consignments that can be legally brought into the EU from third countries are queen honeybees with accompanying bees. That can be maximum 20 of the honeybees accompanying the queen. The document specifying how to prepare and pack the biological material for the movement, what should be the source of the bees, and it also contains information regarding different tests to be performed. And this document also says that the colonies from which queens are coming from should be tested against American foulbrood. So only queens coming from colonies not infested with American foulbrood can be imported to the EU, to the European Union. Of course, we also have to remember that, of course, besides queen honeybees and bumblebees, besides queen honeybees, these documents that I have been describing also cover the trade, the movement of bumblebees. But in this presentation, I decided to focus on the trade of queen honeybees only. Of course, we have to remember that if we are interested in obtaining any information on the current regulations of law, we have to be aware that the documents are changed on an ongoing basis, and if someone is following the law or is interested in obtaining information regarding the state-of-the-art law, the most current law, it is good to use sources that are showing the most up-to-date version of the law in force. And for instance, this platform called EUR-Lex is the perfect platform for it. Moving on, of course, we have to be aware that anything related to the transport and the trading of animals are related to fulfilling certain regulations that I mentioned before. Of course, we have to remember that all this is inspected, supervised by veterinary authorities or any other authorities that are supervising bees in a given member state. Let's remember that if we trade, be it the intra-EU trade or exports or imports with third countries, so no matter where we trade the animals, we have to have relevant health certificates for animals depending what we transport and for what purpose. We should remember as well that, as I said before, if we want to import bees to the EU, we can only import honeybee queens from third countries, but also from the countries listed in this regulation. So, as I have been trying to briefly describe the law that is currently in force as regards trading of bees, this is the law that, in my opinion, is sufficient and working well. Nevertheless, we have to remember that transporting honeybee queens illegally can take place because, in fact, it is rather easy because, for instance, of the size of the cage in which you transport the queens. Going back to the beginning of my presentation, please remember that it's definitely worth trading the bees in a legal way based on the currently binding law. Why? Well, because it makes our lives much easier in a way that it prevents the spreading of diseases which may be completely unintended, and the unintentionally introduced diseases can become a huge problem for all of us. Please remember that all the regulations that I quoted to you are relatively new ones, which means that they also require a lot of work from veterinary authorities to introduce specific procedures and practical implementation bylaws. I believe that what we have legally currently is sufficient. However, I just have to stress that if I'm here talking to beekeepers, if you are trading, involved in importing, exporting of bees, please make sure that this is performed based on the current regulations of law. This law is not here to make our lives more difficult, but the law is here to prevent situations that could be negative for us. Whenever we're talking about the trading, the movement of animals and the distribution of diseases, I'm usually happy to quote two events. The 2004 and the transmission of small hive beetle to Portugal, where the consignment was sent according to all regulations, and this outbreak was immediately identified and eradicated. Well, the second example is the invasion of the small hive beetle in Italy, in Calabria. As you know, according to the currently binding law, all the restrictions related to the ban on trading the bees from Calabria have been in force now until 2024. Summing up, I would like to quote Henry Ford here, saying that joining forces is just the beginning, staying together is progress, and working together is the success. So I would love us to remember about this. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. That has been Andrzej Bober. We have several questions that appeared during the chat. Can we ask them? There is a question that has been here before, but I never asked it to the previous speakers, because I knew that we would have Dr. Bober and he'd be the best to answer it. I learned from the veterinary inspection that beginning with the next year, we won't be able to use acid-based preparations not registered as veterinary medications for baroses or biocides for hygienic. That opinion was sent to our veterinary inspection, and the same opinion was issued by the legislative. What about the oxalic acid stretches and other acids that are mass-produced for hives? Can we produce them and use so that the beekeepers were not left alone with this problem, because they are the ones who will be controlled by inspection, as they are the ones who introduce food to the market. I believe that this complex question as such really answers itself. Well, my dear, we must always remember that we live within certain legal limits, whether we like it or not. If law clearly states, and obviously, that something mustn't be done, this mustn't be done. Let's remember that all the regulations that appear here are not regulations that come into our legal system by chance. We know what it looks like, we know how it is, we know that it causes concern among beekeepers. We are not the legislators. If there are problems connected to the implementation of that law, and whether it can bring some negative consequences, then of course something like that must be notified. But in the current legal situation, if a specific veterinary preparation contains a specific active substance, we must not use it. So, in other words, it can't be used. Speaking of the production of medical preparations, the case is clear as well, that is legally regulated. Well, the law is what it is, and I don't think this would cause any negative perturbations, any negative consequences. Probably what I'm going to tell you won't be popular, but please let's remember that any pharmaceutical substance that is allowed to be marketed has been tested. We know its efficiency, efficacy, its dosage. We know the information about its pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic in the colony. We know how much residue is left and whether consumption of products from those colonies may be harmful for the consumer or not. We are fully aware that the most important element that has an impact on this issue is just the cost. But yes, I always repeat that unfortunately, producing food, keeping bees or any other animal species, we are simply subjected to costs, and if we want to manage those bees, we need to incur those costs. With all my appendages and limbs, I sign and I subscribe to that. We're being overheard. Our speakers also participate actively in the conference. Dr. Piotr Semkiw asks, can Andrzej say a few words about the migrations with the bee colonies in our country, about the current situation and about the ideal situation? Thank you. Thank you, Piotr, for this question. What the situation should be like, I believe that we all know very well. Namely, there should be a system, I believe, based on health certificates when moving bees. But we always have a problem here. Each such shift, each such move will have to be notified, and that would call studies, clinical studies of colonies that are in transit, or laboratory study tests, and that entails costs. You as beekeepers are not really happy to incur such costs. I think this is an important element, even in the context of what we can see, namely this distribution of foulbrood, especially American foulbrood, during such shifts. But as Dr. Gajda mentioned in the beginning, you are the Polish beekeepers, we're talking about the territory of Poland, you have a lot of power here. So I believe that all the initiatives that you can present to the Minister of Agriculture, they mustn't be rejected. They can't be rejected. Perhaps this will call for some time, but I think this is sufficiently important and significant to have such regulations introduced. Well, let's remember that the document I mentioned before, the animal health law, will soon change our act on the protection of animal health and fighting the contagious diseases of animals. I don't have the working document, but perhaps some guidelines could be found there on transporting bees. But if you have your fears, you can always send requests. In Poland, veterinary services are institutions that report to the Minister of Agriculture and Rural Development. We can always develop solutions. Thank you. Now, traditionally putting a stick into an anthill, and I love this question. Why practically everywhere in agriculture we can have antibiotics, but not in beekeeping? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to be popular again. Let's really call it this stick in an anthill, or stirring some commotion. I always explain it the same way. So some of you might have heard it. I'm going to repeat myself. The first and foremost, you are a food producer. Full stop. For antibiotics, there are no MRL values, the maximum residue limit. We don't know how much of a specific antibiotic or sulfonamide we can put into a colony to obtain the effect we want to obtain. For me, okay, abstracting from the aspect connected to the residue and consumption of the residue by people. But let me now dwell a bit more on this subject. Low dosages of antibiotics always causes resistant strains in bacteria. That, my dear, results in the bacteria that several years ago we never heard. All the cases of sepsis. They only happen because people consciously or unconsciously eat low doses of antibiotics, which don't kill bacteria but make the bacteria resilient to antibiotics, and we have them in the environment. And in case of illness, those antibiotics won't work, and the problem, the sepsis, develops very quickly. Moreover, giving bee colonies antibiotics and sulfonamides doesn't make sense, because if you know a bit the biology of pathogens, you will learn that, especially when it comes to American foulbrood, that's a pathogen that will not lose its virility for several decades. Therefore, even if we use, or we would use for bee colonies, some substances of that type, without disinfection and hygiene, this won't make any sense. Let's remember that if the infecting factor is there in a bee colony, and if it does not yield to the substance, then all our activities is just hiding the symptoms. As soon as we stop adding a specific chemical, they will return, because we never even address the root cause, but we work only on the effects. That's why these substances are not used. Is there a need for them? I don't think so. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, we always like shortcuts. We want to lose little time, but as I mentioned before, about those pharmaceuticals, well, unfortunately, over the years, our way of keeping bee colonies has changed, it has evolved, and it costs us more and more time, but there's no escaping from that. Thank you very much. If I could, I would give you a standing ovation, but I don't believe my high heels would allow. I believe we may have time for one more question. Dear Andrzej, what do you think about the freedom of moving bees within the EU? If yesterday we learned, and this results from plenty of studies, including also Kolos, that the local bee is best adapted to the environment. So would a Spanish or Portuguese bee be brought to Poland? Of course, we want to have adapted and fairly resilient bees, but I believe that this is what our surveys show. Is it something like I want to have a cake and eat cake? A perfect question, ladies and gentlemen. We must remember one thing, namely that no one's going to forbid anything. Of course, if you want to move bees, I'm talking about whole colonies or bee queens within the EU, you can do it on the condition of meeting the requirements that I have presented to you in the acts of law I quoted. But it is a fantastic question, because many people don't really realize, perhaps they may do, but only to the minimum degree, that other than just the genetic potential of a given organism, it's important to remember the environment in which this organism lives. Well, let's remember that the law is only for specific illnesses I've mentioned, but let's not forget that transporting such bees, we also, whether we want it or not, we transport other pathogens, viruses, for example, that can also be alien pathogens for our bees. So transmission of those illnesses that are not envisaged in law can also occur. Which is why, yes, you can transport, but if we do it, let's do it in a way aligned with the binding law and legislation. And especially, let's remember that things that work perfectly well in one country will work equally well in another. Thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting lecture and all the questions. There are plenty of other questions. So we see that this is a hot topic and it concerns us all, but because time's flying, we've got to pass on to the following item on our agenda. Thank you very much, Andrzej Bober, for being with us. Thank you for devoting so much time to us and answering those interesting questions. I hope there will be an opportunity to discuss this subject.